Classic game design has 3 distinct characteristics. The first is a single session playthrough, meaning you're meant to play from the beginning of the game to the end of the game in one unbroken sequence. Even if the sequence takes a long time, it's meant to be self-contained, and you begin each playthrough fresh at the same starting point. So in Pac-Man, you're on stage 1 with 0 score. In chess, you're at the traditional starting position. And in Brood War, you've got your command center and your worker units. And so what makes each playthrough different from one another is the second distinctive characteristic, which is performance analysis. In arcade games, this is very obvious: score. The higher your score, the more superior the playthrough. And then in directly head-to-head games like Brood War and chess, you have win, loss, and draw. So you have degrees of success and failure. And speaking of failure, that brings us to the third distinguishing characteristic of classic game design:
true failure.
Also commonly known in video games as permadeath, where losing is not just going back to the nearest checkpoint or preventing you from moving forward in your progression. Loss is the erasure of your gameplay and going back to the first characteristic, the fresh playthrough. And so progress in classic game design is measured externally, not internally. And I know arcade games have like leaderboards built into them, but those leaderboards are external of the game's rule set. And so, of course, here on the channel, I'm a huge defender of arcade games and classic video game design, but I also wanted to include the examples of chess and competitive games like Brood War, because there's this misconception that I often see that classic game design is somehow primordial and belongs in the past with cave paintings, which I think is a very ignorant view of game design, but it's something I see very pervasively, especially among modern critics, because what ended up happening is that as the arcades left the public setting and went into the home console setting and home PC market, they had a shift in design very much like from theatrical film to television, where they didn't need to worry about some other guy showing up in your house and playing your cabinet, and so they can now stretch out the experience and have progress be ongoing rather than self-contained single sessions, especially with the advent of saving games. It is a radical shift in not only how games are designed, but also how games are consumed. I think how they're consumed actually matters more than how they're designed, because on paper, when it comes to measuring progress and player skill and a lot of these really strong core classic video game concepts, these could be translated to a home console setting. It is possible design-wise. And in fact, if you look at the PS2 era and early console era, you notice these impulses from game developers with their background in arcade design still lingering. Vestigial tales existing. Like if you play Resident Evil, the earlier ones, you get to the end and you get like a ranking of your playthrough. And then, of course, even in the Super Mario games, if you play Super Mario 1 on the NES, it is a classic video game. It has score, it has permadeath. But then as Mario progresses forward, when you get to Mario 3 on the NES, now permadeath land resets rather than full game resets. And then you continue forward even more, and you get to the Game Boy Advance version of Super Mario 3, and there is no even land reset. And that ends up being the design mantra of modern progression-based games in the end. Because even though on paper you would say, oh, players will care about their end of game ranking in Metal Gear, or they'll care about some sort of ranking system like in Devil May Cry, if you look at player behavior, they don't care. Most players don't care if they get an S rank or not. All that matters is
completion.
Completion is the design mantra, the impulse of the modern player. And so how that affects game design is that difficulty can no longer be holistic like it was in the single session days. In the single session days, how you played on stage 1 really mattered when you were playing stage 5, because if you died a bunch of times in stage 1, you really want those resources when you're in stage 5. But with this progression style of difficulty, challenge can only be segmented like a one-way valve. And yes, you could say on paper, progression-based games could soft lock or force reset the player's progress if they don't manage resources correctly, but it undermines the key fundamental value of progression-based gameplay, which is loss aversion. Modern progression-based players are extremely loss averse. In fact, if this occurs, it is an objective problem with the game design in their opinion. Just look at how people talk about checkpoints even now. And what ends up happening is it builds and builds and builds and reinforces itself to the point where all of those sort of ranking performance metrics from the classic era, if you follow along, they all start to disappear. The only meaningful metric to the modern player is getting to the end of the content. And this is the world that FromSoft were developing for in 2009 with a game called Demon's Souls. And what is so fascinating about Demon's Souls is it is a classic game design ethos speaking a modern language. It is a reinterpretation of classic game design. That is what is so interesting and special about Demon's Souls and why it succeeded at a scale much larger than its more classically speaking peers like Ninja Gaiden. One thing that I've very much come to understand in today's review, having played through Demon's Souls extensively now, is how much more alike Demon's Souls and Ninja Gaiden are than people realize. But the key distinguishing point between the two is that Demon's Souls is using the language of modern progression-based play and reinterpreting it in a manner that I like to call brute force structure. Like I said earlier, modern progression-based players simply do not care about performance metrics like score or rank, at least in single-player games. In multiplayer games, they are a lot more sensitive to these because of the social elements attached to those. But in single-player games, just look at the Steam achievement rates for stuff like S ranks and Devil May Cry and these types of things. And even outside of the player behavior, if you look at the reviewer behavior, mainstream reviewers, when was the last time they really seemed to care about S ranks and how to achieve them and explaining the scoring systems and not just telling you about them, but like actually evaluating, are the scoring systems good or not? What are the strengths and weaknesses? These types of things never happen. And so what Demon's Souls did, which I think is bold and brilliant, is it took a lot of these classic principles like playing consistently, losing progress, routing out the levels, memorizing and routing the enemy design. A lot of these core concepts and skills that you learn and apply in classic games, Demon's Souls imported into its design philosophy, but then brute forced them into the structure. And that is what made it work. Because if you make these principles optional, if you make them part of some external metagame, at least up until the Souls series existed, the modern player base did not appreciate or understand these concepts. Just look at how people reacted to like shmup ports on the Xbox 360. They really thought if they credit fed through the game, that was like validly completing it. And that is a fault of the port of not speaking their language. Whereas Demon's Souls is speaking the language. And a beautiful opening statement is the game's first level. It is so funny to go back and retrospectively look at how people reacted to Demon's Souls, because yes, now that this lexicon has been more established and now people appreciate it and understand it, now critics and players are a little bit more embarrassed to admit that they were not initially appreciative of this style of design.
Friends, I have an awkwardly titled monkey on my back that has been stealing my peanuts for many years. A monkey named Demon's Souls. Ever since my Dark Souls epiphany when I realized I love From Software's grim high-difficulty action RPGs hurt me more, daddy, the monkey keeps asking if I'm going to redo my pre-epiphany Demon's Souls review, or I complain about how it's too hard, and my feet hurt, and the waitress was very disrespectful.
And so when you play the first level of Demon's Souls and the way this game is structured, it is clearly a statement to the player. First of all, it has very classic style level design. The second you begin the stage, you've already got dudes just coming at you full force. And then as you go through the castle areas, it funnels you down this channel and it keeps you really constrained and things are leaping out at you. There's a lot of classic game design principles that people would say is arbitrary and unfair, like the fact that you need to memorize a little bit, the fact that you need to be punished, and then from the punishment you learn, all right, these dudes act this way, the levels are set up this way. The extensively long checkpoints simulate the consistency check of the permadeath systems of classic games. And even with the recovery after death, it's not just given to you for free. If you want to retrieve your progress, you do have a chance, so it's giving that concession, but it's also taking on the risk of, okay, you need to play consistently to get back to where you were, otherwise your progress is gone forever. So there are real permanent failure states in this game that simply do not exist in a purely progression-based system. And as the Souls lexicon has seeped into the player base and the critic base a little bit more, it is understood now that in order to have a more elevated style of difficulty, you cannot have guardrails constantly up for the player. And on top of that, you need to stack challenges in one unbroken sequence. Because if you constantly add in checkpoints in between challenges, you do not get that effect of consistency being rewarded. That is brute force design. It is an artistic statement from the developer. This is a game where you will be punished and you will learn from mistakes, even mistakes you didn't know you were making. And that is the only way to get a higher level of design in a single player game. Relating it back to classic arcade games, it takes hours memorizing the route, and getting to the boss has way more tension and meaning for you because of the hell you just went through in order to get to them. And so consistency matters again. It is proving a point that definitely needed to be proved, especially before Souls came around. This is how you learn to play beyond just moment to moment. And also the brute force of just slapping players over and over with loss. You are taking losses. But that's a lesson that I think has been so healthy for players to learn. And I think Demon's Souls is so consistently good at balancing challenge with novelty, with consistency, in a way that I think is incredibly engaging. And without this direct brute force structure, these values would not be appreciated in the way that they are. Instead, they would just be seen as these bonus extra challenges or something that only a small percentage of players can enjoy or engage in, rather than being a core appeal of game design holistically. And so that leads us to the key question of how did Demon's Souls manage to get away with this? How was it able to commit the cardinal sin in modern game design, taking away player progression and being just this punishing and
arbitrary,
as some people would say? How was Demon's Souls able to take a player base that a decade ago would have completely dismissed its design concepts as outdated or poorly made, and won them over to not only highly valuing the Souls series, but seeing the Souls series as the cutting edge of modern game design. And of course, underneath the foundation, like I've talked about, is this classic design element that's very important to recognize. But layered on top of that, I think, is a real magic ingredient that the Souls series specifically has that, again, sets it apart from something like Ninja Gaiden, as much as I love Ninja Gaiden, which is its stoic presentation and neutral manner of communication with the player. This combo of being ruthless in the core gameplay, but then calm, serene, quiet in the way it communicates what is happening to the player, creates a very special effect that helps players accept failure. Like I said before, the wider gaming audience has a really strong loss aversion, and there's also this underlying sense of shame tied in with failure and losing at games. Think of this when you're streaming, how uncomfortable it is, even for me as a player, when you're streaming and you're like dying a lot or losing a lot or really struggling. It's something that I think contributes to this insistence that games don't punish and shame players too much. But with the communication and ethos that the Souls series has, dying is just as natural as succeeding. Loss is the natural state of the game. In fact, like being in soul form is the default version of the character rather than being in human form with your full life bar. That is the exception. And I really like the way Demon's Souls does this because it reinforces this concept, and everything about this game's communication and presentation emphasizes this. For example, instead of saying game over or you failed or something that a lot of arcade games do, which, I love the energy of that, but is going to disincentivize players to some degree. Whereas in Demon's Souls, the screen just says you died. But just as a matter of fact, there's no emotion. There's no getting you agitated or excited. It's like constantly making you numb and chill as much as possible. Same thing with the lack of music. Everything's neutral. Whether you win, whether you lose, the game doesn't really celebrate that much. The game doesn't really cry for you that much. It's just very even-keeled and kind of leaves it to the player to interpret your own experience emotionally. In Demon's Souls, emotions are the true enemy because the game has no specific feeling about if you die to Flame Lurker 400 times. It does not impute any sort of meaning into almost anything that you do in the game, and it creates this very neutral, open-ended experience, and I think that is what has managed to bring in such a wide, massive audience into a style of game that wouldn't normally attract this style of audience, because everyone's coming into this with their own interpretations. That's why when you sit down and talk to people about like playing Demon's Souls and Dark Souls and the Souls series, there's no real clear consensus on people's interaction with this game. Like some people like myself come from more classical arcade backgrounds, so I'm heavily focusing in on melee combat and spacing and these elements of the game. But I was watching a lot of videos for guides to get through the game, and there was other dudes who I don't think have spent a day in their life contemplating stuff like frame data and how many iframes are on the roll and the walk speed and all that kind of stuff, because they're really into builds and stats and items. And that is both the strength and the weakness of the Souls series, I think, is just how open-ended it is. But in terms of appeal and bringing together a mass audience in a time where that is so difficult to do, the game's stoicism is such a powerful tool because it helps players of all demographics drop their own preconceptions and biases and be more open-minded and accepting of what this game is going to put them through, both in terms of reward and punishment. A really strong example of this is the Fool's Idol fight, where I did not kill the summoner dude before fighting the Fool's Idol, but funnily enough, I did come across him first. But because the game's presentation is so neutral and ambiguous, I wasn't sure what was happening. Like, is this an average enemy? Is he an NPC? Is he important? Looking back now, obviously the glowing stuff next to him, okay, kill him. But there's lots of things in Demon's Souls where it's ambiguous. Like, is this guy an enemy? Is he a friend? Is he kind of both? There's lots of instances like that in the game. And it's actually very different than modern game design. Where in a modern game, think of the yellow paint phenomenon we have in modern games. They would literally paint lines to him. There'd be giant signals from the developer pointing at him, being like, kill him, he's a problem. But in Souls, you get a little ambiguous hint. There's some glowing stuff, you decide. But unlike in an average game where I'd walk away thinking oh, that's some developer oversight. If I was playtesting a game and this had this kind of thing in it, most of the time I'd probably be like, yeah, you need to be more clear with the player. You need to communicate with the player. But because Demon's Souls is so effective at creating this consistently stoic tone, instead I just felt like, oh, my bad. I probably should have realized that. And it's not really that big of a deal to fight the boss again. It only took me an hour. I'm sure now I've learned the boss. I'll beat him in a couple of minutes. This type of healthy attitude, the game constantly sort of inflicts upon you. And you have really only two options. You either accept it or you quit. There's no alternative for it. And that, I think, is really cool and something I appreciate a lot, and something I think modern games could really benefit from. This constant insecurity about whether players are bored or lost or frustrated just isn't attractive. And compare to how developers react in modern games to how the Souls developers react. In most games, if there's any sort of complaint or any sort of hey, this is making me frustrated or angry, look how quickly developers jump right on top of consumer demands. Versus Souls, people have been begging for them to make them easier and to remove a lot of these classic design elements. And have FromSoft budged, at least to this point? No, they have not. It's nope, this is an artistic statement. And that ethos, I think, is what makes the Souls series so enduring and attractive. It's just this stoic confidence in its own brutal punishment of the player. There's not a hint of remorse or insecurity, and that is great art at work. Now that I've completed my first playthrough of Demon's Souls, one of the big takeaways for me was just how excellent the level design is. Having not played much of the Souls series before, I've dabbled in Elden Ring a bit and some of the other Souls games, and I've played a bunch of Souls likes for reviews here on the channel, like Rise of Ronin and so forth. I expected something a bit more like the Rise of Ronin, where you're sort of just wandering around and you go begin your mission, then you got to run, and there's lots of traversal and there's lots of trying to make things happen. But Demon's Souls isn't like that at all. It is so focused and direct and so well constructed. The level design of this game is among the best I've seen in modern game level design in a very long time. Where not only is the game excellent at enemy placement and making sure that enemies are active threats to your forward progression, because a lot of problems with Souls like that I've come across is first bit in an area, you're fighting enemies and you're sort of engaging with the game, and then you die and you're like, all right, I can just run past everything, and that is way more efficient, so let me just run past everything. You can still do that obviously a bit in Demon's Souls, but the game is very good at like making that a chore and like blocking you off and making sure, no, you do have to engage with these enemies. And that can become especially brutal when you're kind of stuck and you're trying to retrieve your souls and you're like on pins and needles. So every enemy suddenly becomes 10,000 times more scary because if you die to them, then you're going to lose all your souls and stuff. So the game does an excellent job at keeping the tension and keeping the environment as a factor. I love how your weapons physically interact with walls in this game, where if you're in a tunnel and you've got a big old broadsword, like you can't hit anything because you can't swing the sword around. So you got to like stab it or you got to switch to a dagger. Also applies to the enemies as well, where you can funnel them in. And if they have a sword, you can block off that with the use of the environment. I love how real physical space is such a constant presence in this game. It's not just open combat arenas. That's a real pet peeve I have of modern action games, where everything's just an open combat arena. There's no distinctive identity to any level. In Demon's Souls, every level has a very distinctive identity, not in terms of just enemy types, but also the construction, the physical construction of the level, which I'm a big fan of this being a main factor in game design, because why have 3D games and not utilize their 3D construction? And I really love how Demon's Souls does this with slopes, with ledges, and with verticality. This is such a vertical game. Like when you go from the swamp up to the boss up in the sky, and you have to just run up this spiral staircase, and it's so thin and narrow, and then they put dudes on it to just knock your ass off. I just really appreciate how the game makes use of its environment and how conscious the game's enemies are of the environment and how just evil it can be at times. But it's such a better circumstance than just having flat combat arenas all the time. So I love the use of the environment, and the whole like shortcuts diegetically, that is such an interesting design concept. And I've been trying to identify where this might come from. I talked to Bog about it, and he's saying maybe Kingsfield or previous FromSoft games, because it doesn't seem to be exactly something you see in other games. I mean, you have stuff like that in Super Metroid a bit and Castlevania, but not in the same degree. It keeps that permadeath aspect of classic design in play, that there's one spawn point. And so it creates kind of a game within a game. The level is like its own playthrough, essentially, because there's no checkpoints. You can make these kind of diegetic checkpoints through environmental shortcuts, but I don't know, it's such a brilliant design feature. Obviously, this has become now like a standard in game design way outside of Demon's Souls, and I don't think people appreciate how classic it is, because what a modern game would do, obviously, is just litter checkpoints along the way. So if you died, you just go back to the checkpoint. Stellar Blade does this, and game journalists say explicitly that this is an improvement over Souls because it makes the game more approachable and less difficult, which I obviously don't agree with. And in terms of level design, I want to give a shout out to my favorite level in the game, which is 1-3, the Inner Ward. I love not only the design of this stage, because it's pretty much using all elements of terrain, where you've got ledges, you've got stairs, you've got tight corridors, and then you even have a Ninja Gaiden style mass mob of enemies you need to fight on a staircase. It's not quite as epic as Ninja Gaiden 2, but still, I love the use of the enemies throughout this level. You pretty much get an amazing mix of them, and it's fun to fight the night enemies specifically. They're among my favorites. And so if you're looking for a real highlight in design, I would definitely choose this as an option. And speaking of difficulty, of course we need to talk about this game's combat design and boss fights. So one huge misconception I had about Demon's Souls is how slow-paced this game's combat is. I've heard this so much over the years. Slow. methodical. And so that has actually been one big disincentive for me over all these years to play the Souls games that much and to go back to something like Demon's Souls, because I'm like, oh God, I've had enough slow, methodical combat for a lifetime in other games, like freaking Silent Hill 2 Remake. There's a fair share of slow, methodical combat. So I was very like, what is Demon's Souls going to be like? One thing I was really worried about is that the combat of the game would be really static and scripted, almost like a turn-based combat system, and we've seen this in pseudo-Souls types of games, where you're just going to have to wait for the enemy to attack because they have super armor, and then you have a limited number of responses based on that. Oh, you're going to parry, or you're going to dodge, and then now it's time for you to take your turn. And I was afraid that would be the situation here, but Demon's Souls is not remotely like that. You do actually have a good amount of hit stun on smaller and medium enemies, and you can even do forms of crowd control, which is pretty cool. And more importantly, though, is you have essentially a position-based grab, which is the backstab. I've never really appreciated the backstab that much up to this point because I mostly know it from hearing about Souls PvP. But the backstab is an amazing maneuver that acts a lot like a beat-em-up style throw. It even works in crowd control situations where if you're surrounded by guys, you can go for a backstab because you gain iframes like a throw. And then on top of that, it creates a knockdown. And so you can actually use it not only to have one-on-one duels, but to deal with groups of enemies around you. I love how there are certain things you can do to enemies on Wake Up. And one technique, I'm not sure if this is in later Souls games or not, is this push maneuver, where if you press forward attack, you do this little push. At first, this was the bane of my existence because I kept doing it on bosses accidentally and that wasn't ending well. But it turns out this push maneuver is really cool because it is also like a grab. So if you've got knight enemies or smaller enemies who are turtling, well, you don't just have to wait your turn. You don't have to wait to bait a parry or something. You just push their ass and then attack them during the stun from the push. And in fact, you can even sort of combo these pushes together, which is really fun. Like on the knights, you can push, then heavy, push, then heavy. And I ended up having a lot of fun using this push maneuver. I do hope it is something that is retained throughout the Souls because it really opens up the combat of the game a lot. And I also really liked that both the backstab and the push don't really use all that much stamina. And so they're more based off of opportunity and positioning than stamina limitation. And I'm going to talk about that later with the stamina stuff, which I really very much appreciate. I think the game does a great job of balancing all of its combat mechanics really fundamentally in terms of their startup frames and their recovery frames and their essential frame data. Going along with that, I really liked the system of either holding your weapon one-handed or two-handed. And in my first playthrough, I didn't really utilize it that much, but I didn't realize how it completely changes how weapons work and the hitboxes work. And you do end up routing whether or not you one-hand or two-hand your weapons during certain enemy types or even groups of enemies. And the game has a lot more combat depth to it than meets the eye. I think because Demon's Souls is a little bit more grounded and has that high input buffer, which makes it so you're very careful with the commitment of your attacks. It gives the completely wrong impression that people say where it's like slow and methodical. It's not like that at all. It is quite frantic and fast-paced, especially if you know what you're doing and you're routing ahead. You can always be actively gaining advantage on your opponent, even if it's not attacking, which I think is really excellent. And I think Demon's Souls deserves a lot more recognition for how well done its combat system is. And what I love is that the combat mechanics of this game are very fundamentally balanced, in that if you took the stamina meter away from Demon's Souls, a lot of the combat would remain perfectly intact. And I think what stamina does is essentially just make it so you can't be too spammy or too crazy. It's like trying to keep the game's combat mechanics in check. I prefer this to be done without meter, but I do think it is a testament to Demon Souls' design that if you either made the meter like infinite, or if you made the meter not exist at all, like it was at 0, it would shift things, but it wouldn't shift things fundamentally. I mean, obviously you'd still be able to attack and everything, but I think it does a great job of keeping this stamina part of the system, but not like life or death. That's all the system is about, is managing the stupid stamina bar. And I was also very impressed with the balance of the bosses around the stamina system, because you can essentially walk around almost everything, outside of some rolls required, obviously. But in terms of moving around, like run is so much more situational. The walk speed is very effective. For example, the Penetrator. When you come into the Penetrator, at first you're like, oh, this is a boss that you're just going to need to roll around all the time on, and that's kind of how you first approach it. But then you start to realize, no, the game actually uses a lot of fundamental spacing with your walking and with your movement. And so what you can do is you can just walk in and out of ranges to bait attacks. The Penetrator, you like almost don't even need to roll other than his like lunging attack, because all of his strings and stuff, you can totally maneuver around them with just pure walk speed. And I think that is the fundamental magic of the Souls combat system, where despite all the crazy RPG mechanics and leveling and weapons and all that, at its core, it's still a game that functions completely fine at level 1 with just your basic weapons and your basic moves, and that will be transferable across the entire game without taking damage. And that is so good. That's some classic arcade design. And that's a great balancing point, because then the player can continue to get more OP and stuff. But if you're not wanting to engage with that, you can still just brute force through the game using pure fundamentals, which I very much appreciate. And speaking of fundamentals, let's discuss my favorite boss fights. And so beginning with the first boss, the Phalanx, my first playthrough, I was not a huge fan of this boss. I was like, oh, that's kind of a rough start to the game. It's just this kind of tanky slugfest. But having played through the game another time, I actually came to appreciate the Phalanx a lot more, because I think what it's doing is it's trying to teach the player to fight unlocked. This is my theory, at least. When you go back and fight the Phalanx and you're more fluent at fighting without a lock on, you're like, oh, okay, I kind of get, I think that's what the boss fight was going for, because if you can fight without a lock on, it's no problem at all. It's all about getting around to the back of the enemy, teach you these ideas of like movement, not relying on the lock on, and getting to the back of things. So in retrospect, I think the Phalanx boss fight is kind of a good idea. It doesn't hold up in terms of like the fun factor, but I can see the idea behind it. And then brings us to kind of the next boss, which is sort of the true first Soul style boss, which is the Tower Knight after the infamous bridge section. And I think the Tower Knight is such a mission statement from Demon Souls. It's like, yeah, bosses are going to be giant and ruthless, and they're going to cause you a lot of problems. And Tower Knight stands out as a really cool boss fight because it's one of the few bosses with like little mooks that help it out, and you have to go eliminate the mooks. I actually wish Demon Souls did this a little bit more later on, because it's such a great concept. And once again, my main hang up with this boss fight on my first playthrough was just like trying to use the lock-on system, trying to deal with like its moving limbs while locked on. And you just need to walk behind the dude and be prepared when he leaps backward and stuff. But what I really love about Demon Souls boss fights, pretty much across the board, and Tower Knight's such a great opening intro to this concept, is how fundamentally spacing plays into these fights. It's not these big parry fests or just learning timing. It's much more oriented around like movement and spacing and keeping your ranges and keeping your position relative to the boss. That's why I think the Phalanx was a good intro. It's like, okay, stay behind because they have shields. And then the Tower Knight's sort of emphasizing this once again. Now he has a giant shield and legs stay behind this guy, and you have to attack the heels. And then the armor spider is an interesting one because it reminds me of a Zelda boss gone extremely wrong. And it kind of operates in the same way that a Zelda boss does, where it's like, okay, once you know the trick, it's pretty simple and static, and you're not going to really have much problems with it. But unlike a Zelda boss, learning the tricks is going to be punishing and brutal. And that's what I like about Souls. In a lot of ways, it's like grown-up Zelda, where you have these sort of patterns to the boss that you learn, and then once you learn them, you got it. But you have to sort of analyze it and break it down yourself. You don't have the game being like, yeah, throw the bomb in his mouth, or, oh, you got the item in this dungeon, use it on the boss. I really appreciate how more fundamental even these style of more gimmicky bosses are. And then that brings us to my favorite boss of Demon Souls. I think the best boss of Demon Souls, the Flame Lurker. So first of all, we've learned throughout the game so far all about get to their back. The enemy weakness is their back. And that's a problem with a lot of modern action games. It's like once you learn the formula, you just apply it across the rest of the game and you got it. Demon Souls is like, oh, okay. You want to get to the back of the Flame Lurker? Yeah, you're going to get owned. So Flame Lurker is an inversion of that. You got to take this guy face forward. And I also love the way it plays with dodging limbs, because with the Flame Lurker, it has something very rare in modern game design, which is persistent hitboxes. So with limbs and strikes, if you dodge through it, they come and go. Flame Lurker has a persistent flame hitboxes. So when it pounds the ground, it's not just about avoiding the initial hit. If you go too early, you'll get caught by the flames. So it requires even more precision and even more spatial awareness. And I love how dynamic this fight is. And I ended up fighting the Flame Lurker a little bit underpowered. And what's really cool about him is if you fight him a bit underpowered, he will start to change his attacks subtly and slowly over time. Like in the first bit of health, he'll do a ground pound and then a swing. So if you bait the ground pound and bait the swing, then you go in and slash him. But then he starts doing, in Virtua Fighter, it's called a bare, which means he'll just throw out jabs at disadvantage to keep you on your toes. And then as he gets further on, he'll start leaping at you. And I love the way the game plays with the lock-ons, where if you try to roll backwards or sideways, the lock-on will just completely, utterly fail you and he'll just land on top of your ass. So you have to either learn to fight him unlocked, or if you're locked on, you can't do this. As soon as he starts to jump, you have to roll into him to get that lock-on to behave itself. And I think this is something about myself that is a bit different than a lot of other game reviewers I've noticed, is that I appreciate cameras in games not just as a way to see the game, but as an actual mechanic, including their limitation. And Flame Lurker is a great example of that. You can lock onto him, but you're dealing with pillars and him leaping at you, and then even the flames will sometimes make it hard. So it incentivizes you to use the camera system a little bit more proactively, rather than just expecting the entire game to autopilot itself. That's something I really like about Demon Souls across the board, but Flame Lurker really brings that out. My second favorite fight in Demon Souls is the Man-Eater fight, and I think that's because, once again, I was a bit underleveled when I fought the Man-Eater, and what I love about it is the fact that there's this sort of speed kill element where it spawns the first Man-Eater, and it's not really too challenging in isolation, but then about above halfway, it spawns its buddy to come, and then you gotta fight two of them. And I love how narrow the frickin' walkway is that you're fighting these dudes on. So sometimes a stray hit will kill you, not damage-wise, because they'll knock your ass off the side. And also it prevents you from spamming rolls too much. Like a roll, especially just locked on, is more dangerous than the enemy sometimes. So instead of rolling away for maximum safety, I realized, okay, to get more damage on him and to also keep him on the ground more consistently, when he does his lunge, I will roll with his lunge like I'm playing Super Smash Bros. Melee and I'm tech chasing his ass. So there's a lot of really cool spacing elements these boss fights emphasize that aren't just static, oh, here comes his lunge, parry the lunge or whatever. I thought that was a great fight. And then my final favorite boss fight is Old King Allant. I think a lot of people like this fight. And it was fun and dynamic like the Flame Lurker fight, because it turns out if you're up close to him, he is just a nightmare. And if you're really far away, he's kind of a pain in the ass to deal with as well because of his ground charge attacks and stuff. But there's this sort of mid-far distance. It's close enough that when he goes for the ground pound charge, you can get in on it, interrupt it, especially if you run. But you're not so close you don't have to deal with his crazy ass mix-ups. And so that's a little bit of a technique that he struggles against, but I was really enjoying how much Demon's Souls emphasizes attack ranges and encourages you to try to figure out the weaknesses of the bosses.
Positioning?
The old hero fight was also pretty fun, but a problem with it is that once you learned to go unlocked and you got underneath his legs, he was really struggling to prevent you from just bullying him completely in between his legs. So they could have probably added an attack or two to mix you up and make you get out from under there a little bit more, but still a fun fight and really rewarding if you're figuring out how to play the game unlocked, which I think is kind of a core skill set of Demon's Souls. In the end though, I really enjoyed the boss fights of this game, and I'm really excited to see how they develop across the Souls series, because they're clearly a strong point from FromSoft's design, and I think it's easy to see how they've become so influential across the rest of gaming. But if you've played a bunch of Souls-like games and enjoyed those boss fights, you really owe it to yourself to return back to Demon's Souls and experience the original inspiration. As far as criticism of Demon's Souls goes, my first critique of the game has to do with its game difficulty balance over the playthrough, but not because of that initial difficulty spike. Far from it, I'm a huge fan of that. What I'm actually concerned with is how the difficulty of the game diminishes as you progress further into the playthrough. So in the first few areas, those initial hours of Demon's Souls, it is a brutal fight for survival. It feels like you're just barely inching through. But as you become more familiar with the game's systems, as you become more familiar with the mechanics, and then of course, as you literally level up and increase the RPG side of things, then what ends up happening is you start breaking through that initial difficulty wall, and then the back half of Demon's Souls feels like we are just cooking. And yes, there's still difficulty spikes in there, but it's definitely a lot less intense than the first half because of familiarity and because of the RPG systems. And I do love the Mega Man style level structure where you can choose whatever level you go in. That's excellent. But one thing they should have done is they should have ranked up and scaled the difficulty more alongside with the player progression so that you don't have that breakaway in the game's difficulty. And I know one response to this could be, well, easy solution, just never level up. Play at level 1 throughout the entire game, and then you'd get that more beautifully increasing difficulty curve, which is, of course, a great idea, but that brings me to my bigger, larger critique of Demon's Souls, which is sort of a double-edged sword. Because the game is so open-ended in terms of its design and mechanics, I talked about that's why I think the Souls games have become so popular, because it can cross so many different player demographics, where if you watch tutorial videos on how to be good at Demon's Souls, maybe you'll find a few of them about the enemy behavior and routing and that kind of stuff, but a lot of them will mostly be focusing on, okay, how do you exploit the RPG system? Okay, the magic system is OP, how do you exploit this and make a lot of the natural difficulty of the game kind of trivial? And the double-edged nature of the game's informal structure is that that form of playing Demon Souls is just as valid as playing it in the form that I like to play it, which is more combat, melee focused. But because of this informal nature of the game, both are equally good, both are equally valid. You can't really definitively say, oh yeah, playing level 1 sword only is the definitive version of Demon Souls. Maybe you may feel that way, maybe I may feel that way, but the game itself does not formally recognize this in any manner whatsoever.
Single player game. And
Focused
everyone
streamer smile.
is, has the right to play it however they want to have fun. But I noticed immediately that this is just a thing. You want to put people down for playing the game in any way that's different than you. So that's when I started imposing all these weird, totally arbitrary rules on myself, and then insulting everyone who doesn't agree. And so, to my surprise, it works.
And so, because there is obviously such a thirst for this style of playing the Souls games, then I think the game could really benefit from some more formal systems being added into the game. I'm not saying that they need to change the balance of the game on the whole, because I do understand the value of being able to capture so many different demographics of players. But I'm thinking along the lines of something like in Resident Evil, where they have the Mercenaries mode, or in Metal Gear, where they've got the Subsistence VR missions. I think Demon Souls would have really benefited from some additional formal modes. And so, if you want to play the game as sort of an RPG in the campaign, for progression and all that, go right on ahead. But if you are attracted to the more combat-focused side of Demon Souls, I think it would be great if the game had formal modes to acknowledge this in one way or another. If you had a scoring mercenaries style thing, or a boss rush mode with limitations on leveling, or some kind of special level 1 mode. Obviously, you can inject this into the game yourself, but I always very much value when the game is formally recognizing these types of achievements and these types of ways of interacting with it. And there's obviously a huge thirst for it. I don't know how often when I open my web browser, I don't see an article that's like, a new streamer no-hit all of the Souls games back to back. Like, there's clearly a huge demographic of players who love this sort of thing. And I am actually very curious if Elden Ring Night Rain is going to be keying into this, perhaps. And if it is, I'm very excited to see that. But in terms of Demon Souls, I think the initial launch version of the game, let's not forget, this was pretty experimental. This was not a big budget release. Sony were not super confident about it. In fact, they didn't even release it in the West right away, which I think actually, even though Sony gets criticized for that now, I kind of think was a good move on Sony's part, because I do think that trial period in Japan was very beneficial for the game, because like I said earlier in the review, I don't think the West was prepared for Demon Souls quite yet. So if Demon Souls just showed up worldwide release day 1, God knows how those reviews would have looked. But because it had that trial period in Japan and built up its mystique, and the Japanese players, they're probably going to be a lot more open-minded to this stuff, and it gained a reputation that way, I think it definitely helped a more soft, gentle landing in the West. So that's a big difference, and I think that was a smart move on Sony's part, even though we retrospectively look back on that with like, oh yeah, totally, I would have loved Demon Souls day 1, I'm sure of it. Would you really? So yeah, anyway, going back to this thirst for formal design though, I think if they re-released Demon Souls, they had done like a subsistence version of Demon Souls or a
Ninja Gaiden Black,
I think it would have been excellent if they followed the examples of their peers and had formal modes that people could play in and play for scores or do really intense, insane challenge runs and stuff like that. And another thing about a re-release of Demon Souls is, of course, the original PS3 version is at 30 frames a second, which is not exactly great. Now, it's very functional because of how insanely big this game's input buffer is. But at 30 frames a second, I did the first playthrough at 30 frames a second. I mean, it's very doable, but it just feels a little chunky, right? Whereas in the PS3 emulator, which I was using, there is a 60 FPS patch, and oh boy, talk about night and day improvement. That 60 FPS patch is incredible. Obviously, the 30 FPS could have been fixed in a re-release, and it being stuck on the PS3, that's not exactly great, and I really am not pleased with Sony not just re-releasing the damn thing rather than doing this whole other remake. But that leads us to the conclusion of today's video, which is that in terms of the original game, Demon's Souls is a stone cold classic. I found myself really falling in love with this game in a way that I did not expect, because I've been wanting to talk about the Souls series over the past few years because they're such a core pillar in modern game design, and they have that touchstone with classic game design that I thought was very important to articulate. But I was not expecting myself to really connect with Demon's Souls. I only picked Demon's Souls because it's like the beginning game in the series. I'm like, all right, I got to start at the beginning. But damn, I really connected with this game. Its combat, its level design, how fundamental it is, how just beautifully paced it is. It feels so well crafted. It's no surprise at all that Demon's Souls went on in its subsequent versions, like Dark Souls and stuff, to become such a worldwide phenomenon. I think time has really proven how forward-thinking and incredible this game is, and because I'm just really into Demon's Souls right now, my next review of the Souls series next month is not going to be Dark Souls. I'm just going to go right ahead and tackle the Demon's Souls remake because, for one, I'm very much intrigued by how accurate it may or may not be, and also because I think it would be a great sort of follow-up to this Demon's Souls video because I'll have such a direct comparison and experience. Whereas if I did it later on, that might fade a bit. So that will be my next review in the Souls journey here. And so keep an eye out for that. And also, if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out my review of Resident Evil Mercenaries, because Mercenaries is such a great example of taking a more open-ended, mechanically very strong foundational style of game design, like the later Resident Evil games that I'm also a huge fan of, and then formalizing them into this awesome scoring structure that I think is very much underappreciated. And maybe Mercenaries will be a little bit of a precursor to Night Rain. I really hope so. And so if you enjoyed this review, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I'm a full-time YouTuber, so I would really appreciate if you can support me on Patreon. That is what allows me to do what I do here on the channel, and I've got a lot of cool exclusive content on there that I think you all will enjoy. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alex, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arvin Gordon, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Li, Autoname, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, Bog Hog, Board Basmati, Porky22, Brokeface, Brent Cox, Brian Lucy, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Chaflip, Kristen Sopal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Kipolino, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Jaime Coyote, Host, Concreted, Cooksan 666, Cookson Soup, Choreo, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Des Audio, Dan Matei, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Didaidan, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dio Domke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Quinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Epson Eagle, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Luzama, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gelhoff, Gorgira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk Hans Kowalski, Hero Death, Holy, Han Harthy, HUD, Humongous, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, JMD, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken1008, Kill All Music, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kai Arts, Leonardo McCoy, Ludwa, Alberta, Lord Harrington, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mason Polar, Master Xeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minong, Meister, Mewjam, Michael De Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZVM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwade, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Michigan, Naps91, Queen Charlene, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Perro, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Nogden, Okla Googles, Oleg Tolmatisev, Oregano Dog, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Basteman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Pavel Parole, Peace, Pedro Montoya, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Gulan Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Randoom, Raoul VP, Repeato, RC, Realskeen, Red Holt's Time, Retro Jet, Retro Man, Retro Masters, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, Sanivo, Scanline City, Scott Ernicus, Segfault, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Super Funk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Thana Oat, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2IU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Ursua, Ushimushi, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yusef Khalid, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zeal, Zinryoku, Zingus.